Hello, welcome back to our discussions of MySQL. We're going to get in now to a section on defining data in MySQL, and we're going to start out with a discussion of MySQL data types. So this is the official Oracle MySQL documentation, dev.mysql.com, Chapter 11, Data Types, and you can begin to understand just the complexity and the variety of MySQL data types. So let's take a look at numeric data types, and we'll drill down a few pages into this. And we'll look at some things we've used already. We've used ints, and we've seen decimals and money as well. So you can start to see just the depth that MySQL supports in terms of data types. And to understand the reason why, I understand that SQL started in the 1970s and has had to serve many different types of technologies and programming languages that have attached to SQL and used it as a data source. So in terms of basic data types, it just has a flood of them. Right? Really difficult to start to wrap your head around. So a better way to look at it is to look at it from the Java perspective, from the high-level language perspective. That is, how are you going to use MySQL in a way that's compatible with Java data types? And in that case, I've looked up mapping MySQL data types to Java data types. And found this very nice site, www.roseindia.net. But again, mapping MySQL data types in Java, do a search engine on that and you'll find this page. And here we see the handful of Java data types, relatively handful of Java data types that are mapped to the corresponding MySQL type. Now, since we're programming in Java and that's our general purpose language, these are really the MySQL data types that we're interested in. There's a whole ocean of MySQL data types, again, meant to serve different technologies, different programming eras, and different programming languages. Well, if we're a Java or a C# or a C++ programmer, we're not interested in that ocean of MySQL data types. We're interested in the ones that map the best to our data types from our general purpose programming language. Remember that it's the general purpose programming language that's really handling everything else. So we want to make MySQL do our data storage. So let's take a look at this table here. Strings map to either char or varchar, long varchar, just a varchar that has the ability to have greater length. So let's talk about varchar and char. So the difference there is that if you have char and a char data type and you put parentheses 50, a string up to 50 characters in length, and varchar would be the same thing. Varchar parentheses 50, varchar up to 50. However, the storage mechanism will change for these two types. So char 50 will just be a block of 50 characters stored in the database, always 50 length, always 50 in size, no matter how long the actual string is, from 0 through 50. It will take 50 characters of storage to store that string. Whereas a varchar has a length indicator on it, and it only takes the space on disk required for the string storage. Now there's a trade-off there. It's in a speed, and it's a common trade-off in computer languages, a speed-size trade-off. So you trade off storage space by using char, you're wasting some disk space, but it's faster to read because the SQL engine can do better prediction on how big the record's going to be if it's made up of char types. But in industry, most of the time you're going to see varchars being used. The next two data types, numeric and decimal, you can see are both compatible with a java.math class, big decimal. Now, what big decimal does, it's a class, not most of these data types are primitive Java types. Notice, string is an exception. That's an object for sure. So is big decimal an object in the math class. And what it's meant for is it's primarily meant to hold human-defined or societal-defined data types, such as money. Floating points like doubles have an inherent inaccuracy in them that will cause penny rounding problems if you use them for money. Now, many programmers, Java programmers in the field, are unaware of this problem. So if they're working in finance, they're giving their company a penny rounding error that will bedevil their programmers for years. Use the decimal type when you're dealing with money, and this maps to numeric or decimal in the MySQL database, and we'll learn a little bit more about that when we look at create table statements. So Boolean maps to bit, And then these types here, these are integer types. And think of how many you actually use. This is by far it. The basic int, the 4-byte integer, is by far the predominant integer you'll see in production code. So if you happen to use bytes, these are the mappings to MySQL. But for the most part, when you use an integer, you're going to use an int. So you have to see that maps to a SQL integer type. So these are natural, kind of natural, and even by their names, pretty natural translations. Getting into the floating point type, we have a real, and also the float and the double map to the Java double. That is, the MySQL float and the MySQL double are compatible with double. And then a real is just compatible with a float, which is a smaller floating point type. Again, if you see in production code, if you have a floating point type, it's almost always double. In fact, I've never seen a float being used in production code in years. Okay, so here's a mapping for arrays. Arrays are really, for the database perspective, a lot like strings, or a collection of characters. They're strings that don't necessarily have a collation or a very complex collations, so basically unsortable data. So think about storing a picture or an MP3 file, something other than a string that's a collection of bytes. Then we have the date types, which maps identically, and then finally, the time step. All right. So this is, again, if you start from the MySQL perspective or the SQL perspective, and if you become a SQL specialist, you may need to learn more, of course, about all the different variations of SQL data types and all the different ways it can be expressed. But for the most part, even a production programmer that knows quite a lot about SQL, this should be your primary search. That is, how do I map and how do I serve the Java code with the MySQL storage engine? Next, we'll see how these data types are used and create table expressions. Thank you.